Welcome to the Global Virtual Conference on Commemorating Past Genocide and Learning to Prevent Atrocity Crimes, organized by the Liberation Museum Bangladesh. Thank you so much for attending the first session titled Victimization. I am your moderator for the day, Shauli Dasgupta. We are elated to have our esteemed panelists with us today. Thank you so much for joining. The session is titled Genocide and Victimization, and with us on the first panel, we have Mr. Julian Francis sharing his eyewitness on the genocide of Bangladesh. Then we have Dr. Helen Jarvis to share her notes on the concept of victimization, the correct terminology on using the term victim and survivor. And then Mr. Tawhid Reza Noor, who is doing his postdoctoral in Birmingham University, as he's going to share the significance and preventive capacity of public memory, sharing of the recognition of Bangladesh after 50 years. Mr. Julian Francis, to the world, you have many introductions, but for us, you are the friend of Bangladesh, Mr. Julian Bhai. He has been working closely with the development of Bangladesh since birth. From 1971, he has been working with the Refugee Relief Program, where the Bangladeshis victimized under the Pakistan military army have been suffering, and he has been able to help in the Refugee Relief Program. I would welcome Mr. Julian Francis to share his accounts, his stories with the world today as we start this session on behalf of the Liberation Museum. Over to you, Mr. Julian Francis.
Thank you very much. I feel honored to be speaking to you today in the same way that I felt honored to be part of the discussions in 2017 when the demand was made to declare March the 25th as National Genocide Day in Bangladesh. I always feel emotional whenever I join any function connected with the Liberation War. It brings back many memories of the period when I was a young man in Calcutta in 1971. As far as genocide is concerned, I grew up in London during the years immediately after the end of the Second World War, and as a schoolboy learnt about the genocide which Hitler of Nazi Germany ordered in his attempt to exterminate the Jewish people. However, until about 6 years ago, I had never been asked to speak about genocide. In a way, for many years, I did not talk about my 1971 experiences. They were so painful, I had kept them hidden away. It was only in 2007, during a chance visit to the Liberation War Museum, that I felt able to talk about my experiences of 1971. A few years ago, I attended a planning commission seminar about extreme poverty, and in the address by one of the officials, I learned that 76% of the then population were less than 40 years old and may not know the accurate history regarding the formation of the country. I am regularly asked to write about my memories of 1971, and when I have expressed that I find it difficult to write the same things year after year, Bangladeshis of my age and older tell me that I must keep on writing, as it is important that the people of this country are reminded again and again about the true history of the period before, during, and after the Liberation War. I witnessed the painful birth of Bangladesh, and so it is painful and difficult to understand that some Bangladeshis have not supported the war crimes trials. Surely justice must be done. There are also those who deny that any genocide took place. Whenever someone tells me this or I read this, I become quite angry and also incredulous. I remember families of Bangladeshis, Hindus and Muslims, coming in a traumatized state across the border to access some of the over 900 refugee camps in India. Men, women, and children of all ages struck dumb by the horror of seeing some of their loved ones murdered before they managed to escape. We went to some of the border crossing points to gather evidence to send to Oxfam, with which I was working, and others. While reporting numbers of refugees crossing the border each day, Oxfam's head office in Oxford, UK, the officials there thought that we or the telegram operators had added zeros by mistake. So 20,000 refugees crossing at one border crossing in one day was thought to mean 2,000. I remember that at a border crossing in Cooch Behar, up in the northern part of West Bengal, a white-haired old man lifted his hands towards the heavens and cried out in grief. With gestures, he told us that all his 8 children had been killed. A finger across his throat told the story. I remember also being in a hospital in Krishnanagar, West Bengal, in June 1971, at the same time as an international reporter from, I believe, Newsweek. I remember this young girl in a colorful dress, and this is how the reporter recorded our meeting with this girl, who was about 10 years old. I quote, "The story of one shy little girl in a torn pink dress with red and green bows has a peculiar horror. She could not have been a danger to anyone. Yet I met her in a hospital in Krishnanagar, hanging nervously back among the other patients, her hand covering the livid scar on her neck where a Pakistani soldier had cut her throat with his bayonet. I am Ismata, the daughter of the late Ishaq Ali," she said formally. "My father was a businessman in Kushtia. About 2 months ago, he left our house and went to his shop, and I never saw him again. That same night, after I went to bed, I heard shouts and screaming, and when I went to see what was happening, the Punjabi soldiers were there. My 4 sisters were lying dead on the floor, and I saw that they had killed my mother. While I was there, they shot my brother. He was a Bachelor of Science. Then a soldier saw me and stabbed me with his knife. I fell to the floor and played dead. When the soldiers left, I ran and a man picked me up on his bicycle and I was brought here." Suddenly, as if she could no longer bear to think about her ordeal, the girl left the room. The hospital doctor was explaining to me that she was brought to the hospital literally soaked in her own blood when she pushed her way back through the patients and stood directly in front of me. "What am I to do?" she asked. "Once I had 5 sisters and a brother and a father and a mother. Now I have no family. I am an orphan. Where can I go? What will happen to me?" Perhaps it is necessary to remind people about what happened in 1971, and for the members of the younger generation, it is important to accurately inform them of the genocide unleashed by the Pakistani army and their collaborators. Because of Operation Searchlight, 10 million refugees came to India, most of them living in very difficult conditions in the refugee camps. I cannot forget seeing 10 children fight for one chapati. I cannot forget the child queuing for milk, vomiting, collapsing, and dying of cholera. I cannot forget the woman lying in the mud, groaning and giving birth. In India, I was in Bihar at the time, we had heard of the genocide from the night of the 25th of March. Thousands upon thousands were rounded up and shot, machine gunned, or bayoneted. From the 25th to the 31st of March, eyewitnesses told us it was estimated that about 200,000 Bengalis had been killed. An Italian priest living in Jessore at the time told me that in Jessore itself, about 10,000 had been killed in the 10 days after March the 25th. However, what about the actual numbers? By the end of May 1971, I remember a Dhaka University professor, Samir Paul, who was, as a refugee, helping us to organize camp activities, telling me that till then it was estimated that 1 million Bengalis had been killed inside Bangladesh until that time, May 1971. It is very clear to me that many Bangladeshis died on their way to India, and many more died after coming to the refugee camps as a result of injuries, wounds incurred on the way. I saw people with bullet wounds, bayonet wounds, and some of them did not manage to survive. During the cholera epidemic, I remember that in one refugee camp of 15,000 persons, over 750 died in 1 month, about 5%. People should also remember that many of the refugee camps were severely flooded during the heavy monsoon of 1971. Sanitation could not be maintained, and many died of gastroenteritis as well as cholera. By September 1971, hundreds of children were dying every day from malnutrition, and doctors who had earlier worked in the relief operation in Biafra, Nigeria, were of the opinion that the malnutrition in the Indian refugee camps was worse than that of Biafra. Many more children died as a result of the severe cold winter. In mid-November, an accepted figure of numbers of children dying was 4,300 per day in the refugee camps alone. I still have nightmares about deaths of children in the refugee camps. Sometimes in my nightmares, I see the body of a dead child lying in the rain, its arms and legs gnawed off by dogs and eyes pecked out by crows. My recurring nightmares will not allow me to forget. Aid officials at the time estimated that between 20 to 30 million Bangladeshis had been internally displaced inside Bangladesh, and there would have been significant deaths from those numbers. The US government archives may suggest that a total of only 300,000 died, and the Pakistan archives say that only 2 million refugees came to India. Everyone should know that both these figures are complete nonsense. Rightly or wrongly, personally, I consider all the deaths of all people who left their homes as a result of the actions of the Pakistan authorities and their collaborators as genocidal deaths. Perhaps we will never know the accurate figure. It could easily be over 3 million. Now, 50 years after the emergence of Bangladesh, it is vitally important that the world authorities officially accept and recognize that what happened in Bangladesh in 1971 was genocide. There are many eyewitness accounts that have been documented. For example, the powerful writing of Anthony Mascarenhas, who visited Bangladesh in April 1971. His writing entitled Genocide, published in June 1971 by the Sunday Times. And the British magazine The Spectator, in its issue of June the 19th, 1971, in an article entitled "Another Final Solution," had the following: "We in this country," that's the UK, "like to think that among the reasons why we fought the Germans in the last war was to rid the world of the evil of Hitler and his gang and their genocidal final solution. It is easier to imagine Germany's gas chambers than Pakistan's choleric slaughter in the Bengal plain, but it remains the case, and it ought to be declared, that the Pakistani crime now matches the Hitlerian in dimension and horror and threatens monstrously to exceed it. Difficult and unpleasant though it may be, each one of us ought to endeavor to the best of his ability to imagine the enormity of the Pakistani crime." Another document that details the effects of the genocide in 1971 is the Testimony of 60, a document that we put together in Oxfam with eyewitness accounts by different people, including some very famous people, Edward Kennedy and Mother Teresa, and other notable aid administrators and journalists. There are members of parliament in many countries with family connections in Bangladesh. Bangladesh must involve them in raising the issue in their parliaments about getting the genocide of 1971 recognized as genocide. In UK, for instance, there are 4 British Bangladeshi members of parliament. I am confident that world bodies will eventually recognize that genocide was without question perpetrated by Pakistan in 1971. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian Bhai, for your accounts on the history of Bangladesh, the survivors' history, the accounts of your eyewitness over the years, and for sharing it on the first session of our conference today. We are elated to have you with us, and your contribution remains a crucial part in the memorialization process in the history of Bangladesh. Thank you so much. I would like to invite Dr. Helen Jarvis with us today. She is joining in from Phnom Penh, Cambodia. She is the Vice President of the Permanent People's Republic and was a member of the advisory board of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Justice, the Liberation War Museum. I would not take most of your time. I would welcome you to start your note on sharing thoughts on the concept and terminology of victimization that you have worked on over the last years to understand and explain to us today. Thank you, Dr. Helen Jarvis.
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning, everybody, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm happy to be with you today. This is a really important undertaking, and I think it's a great honor to be part of the opening session together with two estimable speakers too. So I'm sure we all share that honor that we start with talking especially about what happened in 1971 in Bangladesh. Thank you, Julian, for your, if harrowing and difficult even to listen to, accounts. And I've been asked to speak on a more theoretical level of the issue of victimization. I must admit, it's been troubling for me to work on this over the last few weeks because it's such a huge topic and actually such a contested topic. So I'll do my best to put some context of the terminology and application of victimization and genocide. In recent years, of course, we have come to understand that genocide is a lot more than just killing. It's part of what Daniel Firestein calls a social process. And this social process can be analyzed according to stages of genocide. And I think people will probably be familiar with the work by Dr. Gregory Stanton and also Dr. Daniel Firestein, both of whom have looked at the stages of genocide. I won't go into them now because it will take some time, but there are 10 stages in Dr. Stanton's analysis and 6 in Dr. Firestein's. Perhaps I'll just read you the terminology for these stages, just to set the picture. So according to Greg Stanton, he sees the process of genocide as starting with classification, moving on to symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and finally, not to be forgotten, denial. His original analysis framework had only 8 stages, but in the end, he decided that denial was had to be seen as an integral part of the genocide process. And I think this is important for what Julian has mentioned earlier about denial and of continued failure to recognize genocides when they've taken place. No time to go into it now, but largely for geopolitical considerations, I would suggest. Now, Daniel Firestein has a slightly different approach, but essentially the same. This was developed quite independently of the work of Greg Stanton. Daniel looks at 6 stages: stigmatization, harassment, isolation, systematic weakening, extermination, and what he calls symbolic enactment, which in many ways also echoes the denial concept. Now, as you will see, neither of these scholars uses the term victimization in their framework. It's not seen as a stage in the process, but rather as an integral and underlying element throughout all the stages, I think, through acts that eventually that cause harm to somebody and acts that eventually may rise to the level of genocide. And also, for reference, I went back to look at the Genocide Convention, which interestingly enough does not actually use the term victim at all. I must admit I was a bit surprised when I figured that out, because I'd always assumed that victims were there, the heart of the convention. Now, I want to move from looking at frameworks and conventions to look at what people say about Bangladesh and Cambodia in terms of genocide. And these are both experiences that these 2 countries had that have been rejected by many people, or denied, one might say, as genocide. In the case of Bangladesh, often people look at it and describe it as a scenario of mass deaths, and perhaps they can be collateral damage from a war between East and West Pakistan. And these two groups shared the same supposedly unifying dominant religion. So how can we talk about genocide? So that's the basis that it's rejected, I think. In Cambodia, also, collateral damage of the Second Indochina War, often known as the Vietnam War, or in Vietnam as the American War. and in both cases, perhaps some people may concede that certain groups, in the case of Bangladesh, perhaps the Hindus, in Cambodia, perhaps the Vietnamese or the Cham minority, we could use the term genocide, but not for the overall majority, the overwhelming majority of deaths, which were of the dominant majority group. Some of these analysts, scholars, lawyers, jurists reject the application of genocide by relying on the grounds of the limited number of protected groups that are mentioned in the Genocide Convention itself. And I'm sure you are all too familiar that national, ethnical, racial, and religious groups are the only ones mentioned, and not cultural, social, economic, gender, or other groups. Some of those people then go on to say that we should campaign for an amendment of the Genocide Convention to add these other groups. This may be a very unrealistic expectation, considering how difficult it was to get the basic convention recognized, but nevertheless, there are people moving in that direction. In a number of countries, in their national legislation, other groups have been enumerated. In a number of South American countries and European countries, including France and Spain, go on to add other groups, and in many cases say, or other groups, so leaving the door open for others that may not have been mentioned. I should mention gender as one that often comes up as a suggestion. But there's another way of looking at it, and that is that perhaps we could see both the Bangladesh and Cambodian tragedies as actually more rather closely resembling Raphael Lemkin's original concept of genocide. And Daniel Firestein has spent some time highlighting this, which he sees destruction of the identity as the key feature of genocide. And he proposes that most cases of modern genocide could be seen as what he calls reorganizing genocide. And he quotes, I'll quote him here, extermination designed to destroy and reorganize social relations, transforming the social fabric to such an extent that the national group disappears as such and becomes radically different. And I think if you look through this lens, then Cambodia and Bangladesh both can be seen more clearly as fitting genocide. The physical elimination of at least part of the victim group is intended to have a profound effect on the survivors. And quoting Firestein again, it aims to suppress their identity by destroying the network of social relations that makes identity possible at all. The main objective of genocide destruction is the transformation of victims into nothing and the survivors into nobodies. That is their social death. Now, this understanding of genocide has spread beyond the arena of scholarly argumentation, and it has been taken up by a number of people's tribunals and is now also being applied in a number of official state-run tribunals, particularly in Latin America. The most important application is in Argentina, which is the country of Daniel Firestein. And there, the persecution wreaked on the country by the military dictatorships in the 70s and 80s has been seen as partial destruction of the Argentine national group. And in around 20% of the many cases that have been put before a number of tribunals that have been held all through Argentina, some 40 cases in 14 different tribunals have found genocide on the basis of partial destruction of the Argentine national group with an intent to restructure and reorganize the society. In Cambodia, the prosecutors in the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, we call the ECCC, did not even try to argue that there was genocide against the Cambodian nation as a whole, as had been, interestingly enough, recommended by the UN group of experts prior to the establishment of the tribunal. They decided that it was too controversial and they might lose it, so they didn't even make the case, to the great disappointment of many of us who had expected this to come forward. However, in the trial chamber, in the written judgment of one of the cases, case known as case 002/2, one Cambodian judge did issue a separate opinion in which he expressed his regret that this argument was not placed before the court. Judge Yu Uttara joined the scholars and other judges that I've mentioned above in insisting that the Genocide Convention does not make such a restriction that it has to be by another group and from a majority. And he says, I do not discern from Article 2 any requirement that perpetrators and victims of genocide must be from entirely distinct groups. And he concludes by saying, if it had been proved that the Khmer Rouge intended to purify Cambodia by intentionally destroying a substantial part of the Cambodian national group, both in terms of numbers and in the qualitative features of society, its religion, leaders, political and social and cultural features, which, and this is the crucial point, defined the national group as it stood, the ECC might have been able to give such deaths and destruction their proper meaning. But as I say, it was not raised. I look forward, perhaps in the discussion, to hearing more about the current situation in the International Criminal Tribunal in Bangladesh, as to whether genocide has gone beyond minority. We do not have time today to go into many other debates that continue to swirl around the issue of who can be seen as victims of genocide, what measures are used to determine whether a person belongs to a group, whether the group exists at all, let alone whether it's protected by the Genocide Convention, and what degree of directness to the crime do they need to establish in order to qualify as victims. In conclusion, the principal victims of any genocide are, of course, those who lost their lives. But victims also include the survivors who suffered both directly and from seeing their relatives, friends, and neighbors dying before their eyes or being taken away to be killed. Many have had to live afterward, not only with the trauma, but with a certain guilt for having survived while so many others died. Even subsequent generations, I believe, can be considered as victims, for they were born into a society severely lacking infrastructure, as well as traditional institutions and leadership, including the role of the elders and their parents who died. And increasingly, these people who lived through the genocide and those who came afterwards have shifted their self-identification from the term victim to survivor as they join in rebuilding their societies, reclaiming agency and empowerment. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Helen Jarvis, for your accounts in understanding the correct terminology when we work in the field of genocide and crime against humanity, and most importantly, providing victim or survivor support. It was really important for all of us to understand the correct term towards working for their recognition. I would like to invite Dr. Tawhid Reza Noor now, who is currently doing his postdoctoral in Binghamton University, New York, welcoming you to share your thoughts on remembering Bangladesh genocide 50 years later.
Thank you very much. I'm really feeling very happy on this 50 years of Bangladesh Liberation War time. This event is being held, and I'm still privileged to be a panelist together with Professor Helen Jervis and Mr. Francis Julian. So anyway, for my presentation, I'd like to share one PowerPoint. If it works, then fine. Otherwise, I'll just continue. I'm trying to share that. So already the moderator told about the topic of my presentation. Let us just see few images from 1971, and all of us know that what had happened during that time. If we remember what Louis Buñuel talked about, our memory is our coherence, our reason, our feeling, even our action. Without it, we are nothing. So, you see, in case of any post-conflict societies, in order to understand their identities and how individuals within this context heal and move forward, memory plays a central role, the way Conway sees. Memory basically is a label for a diverse set of cognitive capacities with which human beings retain information about and reconstruct the past in and for the present. The University of Cambridge Post-Conflict and Post-Crisis Research and Discussion Group tried to talk about memory, that it is related but distinct to perception, imagination, or knowledge, as well as significantly connected to emotion, trauma, reasoning, and morality. At the same time, the act of preserving memories and events of people is also referred to memorialization, and that allows us that allows individuals to remember and honor their loved one. In case of public memory, this very term refers to the process of preserving memories of people or events of a given community. Cassay tried to make a small distinction between collective memory and public memory, saying that collective memory describes the reality that different groups can relate to the same past even without having to relate to each other, but remaining disconnected. And public memory, when various groups of people come together in the public sphere through the memory of a certain event. So that is why collective memory becomes public memory when those diverse groups of people come together in space, time, and body to remember that past together. So togetherness is a precondition for public memory. And in case of memory versus history, Geddes talked about that memory has many different meanings, ranging from recollection of individual experiences to sedimented experience, with which past guides our actions in the world at an often subconscious level. And also, scholars and practitioners discuss memory in the context of post-atrocity societies. They most often refer to interpretations of the past that impact the present. And you see, what we see is memory and history usually is considered as different because they are not same. Public memory more informal, diverse, and mutable, but history is formal, singular, and stable. But in a recent paper, Bennett tried to remind us that no difference, we should not consider any difference between what is memory and what is history. The memory of victim, according to her, the memory of victims is the history of the genocide. When the genocide is recognized as a crime and justice, then the world can mourn together and remember together. And when we remember, we preserve more than the history of the event, including who we actually lost during that atrocities. When genocide is memorialized, we do not forget and we do not leave it in the past. So we carry with us all those past experiences that should not be repeated. We consciously choose to preserve that memory and never let it happen again. Genocide, the focus of public memory usually is the community. It focuses on the community after genocide in what they choose to remember and how they achieve that goal of memorialization. Now, I'll just try to say very quickly about the significance of memory. In the aftermath of any conflict, individuals and societies recreate narratives of their past, and in that case, memory becomes a very central component in the recreation of that narrative of history, because it is a prism through which individuals and societies experience their environment. And memory plays a very important role in building individual and as well as collective identities through sharing, constructing, and transmitting memories within a society or a group. And different approaches are there that concern with recalling the past, and also it gives a place and reconstruct it into future, such as historical accounts, narratives, and remembrance are in place. Again, if you consider significance, memory also works as an action. It has individual, collective, and cultural dimensions. And it is the force by which basically past interacts with the present, and it becomes a driving force behind conflict, how it is carried out, and how it can be resolved. So for resolving also we need to carry over these memories. Finally, the memory and the creation of a narrative may be a prerequisite for healing, which will subsequently support processes of coexistence and reconciliation. Memory initiative may involve the competing goals of the search for the truth, a means of producing information, accountability, and support for court hearings. So for preventive capacity in case of genocide, we need to consider this important point. Already Professor Jarvis talked about genocide, about Stanton states theory, and also other issues centering genocide, and also Mr. Francis Julian talked about his experience, direct experience in case of Bangladesh genocide. So in case of preventive capacity, we need to remind again that during periods of genocide and mass atrocity, two processes that are common across almost all cases are: one is fragmentation and atomization of civil society. When we say fragmentation, it's basically breaking down of society into pieces or specific identity groups, so that these groups eventually cease to interact or associate with each other. And if we just consider, in case of Holocaust, it was Jews and other undesirable social groups who were isolated from the whole German society. In case of Rwanda, Hutus and Tutsis, and in case of our country, Bangladesh, Bengalis versus non-Bengalis, or Malauns in case of Hindus and Muslims. When we talk about atomization, the breaking down of even these separate identity groups into sole individuals who feel so alone and so threatened that by the perpetrated regimes, so the fear even coming together, so they actually lost their all kind of willingness to get united. Usually it happens in case of any totalitarian society. And so when the civil society gets fragmented and atomized, at that time, it is notable risk factor for atrocity. And if we talk about the public memory varieties or memorialization efforts, it comes in many forms, ranging from ceremonies to gatherings to physical pieces of remembrance like a memorial or museums. So if we again split this varieties like including law, policy, education, holidays or day for commemoration, institutions like museums, memorials, research centers, documentaries, films, dramas, etc., books, research work, first-person accounts, testimonies, and so on. In case of Bangladesh, Bangladesh had to actually confront many challenges right after getting its victory. Like we all know that after three and a half years, within 3.5 years, Mujib was killed. Then constitution got violated. And there was long denial efforts, very deep denial efforts, and there was rehabilitation process on for anti-liberation forces or elements all through the society. Military rule was there, systematic destruction of resources in case of Bangladesh relating to Bangladesh liberation war and genocide, and many dishonoring attempts, including the freedom fighters and others who have been related to our liberation war. They got dishonored this or that way. In case of law and policy, usually a country should consider the constitution, and in case of Bangladesh, there is acts also for prosecuting war criminals of 1971, and also we have few other favorable laws and policies supporting endorsing genocide and liberation war. In case of genocide, days, there are 4 specific days for Bangladesh related to liberation war, starting from March. National Genocide Day and Independence Day in March. 14 December is Martyr Intellectual Day, and 16 December Victory Day. Also, the nation commemorate the 21st of February as the part of or then the root of our liberation war, Language Movement Day, which is now considered as the International Mother Language Day. In case of museum, in our country, we have a national museum and also Martyr Intellectual Museum at Rajshahi University, then Bangabandhu Museum, Liberation War Museum, Shahid Jahanara Imam Museum, 1971 Genocide Torture Archive Museum, and there are a few other small museums. And I'm just trying to give very quick snapshot of actually what we have basically in the country for memory. There is also national memorial in Jatiyo Smriti Saudha. There is also another for the Martyr intellectuals. In Rayabazar Killing Field, there is another memorial. The Mirpur Jollat Thana, that was another killing field. Chuknagar in Shatkhira, another killing field. So we have in country there's different in different places there are some specifically has been identified to go and actually pay respect over there, but that is not enough. In case of research center, we have Dhaka University. There is a specific center for genocide, liberation war museum. We have as for researching on liberation war. But basically, if I talk about our country, for liberation war research or research related to our liberation war genocide, we have hardly any place to consider. Basically, personal or individual initiatives mainly took place, or that initiative was more prominently done. In case of documentary films, other than 9 Months to Freedom or 9 Months to Freedom and some other documentary films, which was prepared by or developed by the people of India. Other than that, it was Johir Rahan.
Thank you, Dr. Tawhid Reza Noor.
I'm sorry.
We are short on time. We have a few question answers waiting for all of you. If you wrap up just now.
You give me?
Just a minute would be.
Oh, sure, no problem. I'm just trying to go that in my last 2 slides. It is not enough. 50 years of Bangladesh war could be a good good point for us to focus on. My final words, I would like to share. People must remember the horrific events in order to memorize genocide. The more the stories of victims are told, the more inclined people are to believe them and work to stop abuse and persecution. When the victims are allowed to remember and memorialize their genocide, the society is better educated and is able to hear from the great injustice done to them. My last slide is, which victims are allowed to mourn, that society will be able to move forward and create a better society for the next generation. and they can stop the generation of post-traumatic stress disorder and communal grief. And finally, when laws are upheld and museum formed and movies made, books written, society recognizes that something terrible has taken place and it should never happen again. Thank you very much for including me in this important session.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And we have a question for Dr. Helen Jarvis. That is, why do you think the element of mental harm is less highlighted than the physical harm of victim or survivors?
I'm sorry, could you repeat it?
Yes.
Sorry,
so the question that has come, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. So the question,
yes, go ahead.
The question that has come for you is, why do you think the element of mental harm of the victim is less highlighted than the element of physical harm of a victim?
Well, I think it's a much broader question in society, really. It's not just the harm for victims in the case of genocide. I think the issue of mental harm and mental issues, mental illness, mental disability, until now in society generally is far less recognized and less recognized, but in many ways, whether it's noticed, whether it's addressed, whether it engages empathy or sympathy from people. I think that generally speaking, physical harm is much more obvious. And also that there's a lot of taboo about psychological harm and damage. And it's much easier to say to somebody, or just forget what you're remembering, forget those nightmares, just put it behind you. It's a lot easier to say that to somebody than to say, well, I'm sorry you lost your leg, or your something physical. So I think it's sort of fairly obvious. Is there more to the question than I'm reading into it?
Thank you so much for your answer. We have one more question for Dr. Tauhid Reza Noor. Somebody in our chat boxes has given a question for you. When do we consider public memory as history?
Sorry. Yeah. When we consider public memory.
Yes, the question is, when do we consider a public memory as history?
Okay, the thing is, when a society came across with some traumatic experiences like genocide, in that case, of course, people carry those experiences with them. So in that purpose, public memory should be a vital source of the history. So that's why I'll say, in case of a conflict, post-conflict society, public memory should be considered as history.
Thank you so much. We have one last question for our friend Julian Francis here, and that is, how do you think that when we collect testimonies from the victims or the survivors, that it helps them towards memorialization or the recognition in their aspect? What is the role that collecting testimonies has with regards to this?
Well, I think it's very beneficial to the person giving the history, the personal history, because as I personally I had bottled everything up inside me, and it was like a liberating experience to be able to talk to people about it, and then when you start talking about something you remember, you remember more things, and then you remember other people who you could try to connect with again to remember more. So I think it's a liberating experience.
Thank you so much, our esteemed panelists, for joining us and in our session on the Global Conference organized by the Liberation War Museum, for sharing your accounts of your eyewitnesses in the genocide of Bangladesh, for sharing the concept and the correct terminologies when it comes to victims and survivors, and for sharing your notes on understanding the different types of memory and when the memory of a victim becomes the history and the role it plays for the recognition of Bangladesh 50 years after. Thank you. And the session is now ending. So thanks to all of you for joining in.